December 1943. A young Grumman mechanic on the USS Essex watches as his 19th Hellcat of the day roars off the deck, then turns to his logbook with an exhausted grin. He's just swapped an entire engine in 47 minutes, a feat that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Across the Pacific, a Japanese Zero pilot with over 200 combat hours stares at gun camera footage from his wingman's final flight. The film shows something disturbing, not the kill, but what happened after. The American fighter they shot, riddled with holes that should have been fatal, simply kept flying. It banked, climbed, and disappeared into the clouds. The pilot leans back, troubled by a question his commanders don't want to hear. What if we're not fighting the plane, but the system behind it? The numbers tell a story that should be impossible. Between 1943 and 1945, Grumman produced over 12,000 Hellcats. 12,000! The Japanese, with their entire industrial capacity strained to breaking, managed fewer than 11,000 Zeros across the entire war. But here's what the raw production figures hide, something far more devastating. While Zero squadrons in late 1944 were cannibalizing 3 broken aircraft just to get 1 airworthy, Hellcat squadrons were logging availability rates above 90%. The question everyone asks is whether the Hellcat was simply a better fighter. The question almost nobody asks is how American carriers kept them flying when Japanese carriers couldn't. The answer isn't just in the blueprints, it's in a completely different philosophy about what makes a weapon effective. When Grumman's chief engineer Roy Grumman sat down with his team in 1941, he did something unusual. Before sketching a single line of the airframe, he invited a Navy maintenance chief into the room. Not a test pilot, not an admiral, a grease-stained veteran who'd spent 15 years keeping carrier aircraft operational in salt spray and 100-degree heat. The meeting lasted 6 hours. They discussed panel access, engine mount design, and hydraulic line routing. Most aircraft designers treated maintenance as an afterthought, something mechanics would figure out in the field. Grumman treated it as a primary design requirement. This decision, boring and unglamorous, would kill more Japanese aircraft than any dogfighting manual ever written. Every aviation historian loves to discuss the Hellcat's performance advantages. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the 650 caliber machine guns that could saw through an enemy fighter in seconds. These matter, of course, but there's a detail buried in maintenance logs that reveals something else entirely. The Hellcat's engine could be completely removed and replaced in under 2 hours by a crew of 4 men. The Zero's engine required a specialized team, intricate disassembly of surrounding structures, and at minimum 8 hours, assuming parts were available. Now imagine you're a carrier captain in 1944. You've got battle damage, mechanical failures, and combat losses. Which fighter lets you maintain squadron strength? The choice becomes obvious, but not for the reasons most people think. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the war's most skilled pilots, wrote something in his memoir that his own command wished he hadn't. He described encountering Hellcats over the Philippines in late 1944 and feeling something he'd never experienced before. Not fear of the aircraft's performance, but exhaustion at their sheer presence. Shoot 1 down in the morning. 2 more appear by afternoon. Damage 3. All 3 return the next day. The Americans, he wrote, seemed to have an infinite supply. They didn't. They simply had a supply chain designed for war. Let's talk about what that meant in practice. Grumman didn't just build aircraft, they built an entire ecosystem. Every Hellcat rolled off the line with detailed maintenance documentation, not a technical manual full of engineering jargon, but illustrated guides that a 19-year-old farm kid could follow. They created modular assemblies, entire sections of the aircraft that could be swapped as single units. Damaged wing panel? Don't repair it at sea, unbolt it and install a new one. Landing gear acting up. The entire strut assembly came out in 20 minutes. This wasn't revolutionary technology. It was revolutionary thinking. But here's where the strategy deepens. While Grumman was designing for maintainability, the U.S. Navy was building something even more crucial, a logistics network that treated spare parts like ammunition, Pre-positioned supply ships carried not just a few replacement components, but entire aircraft worth of parts, organized by failure rates and combat damage statistics. When a carrier task force steamed into battle, it carried its own rolling factory. The Japanese had skilled mechanics and adequate supplies at major bases. What they didn't have was the infrastructure to keep fighters operational at the front lines, where wars are actually won. By 1944, Japanese squadrons were stripping parts from hangar queens and flying aircraft that should have been grounded. American squadrons were making repairs that would have seemed like magic to their opponents. And there's something else. Something that connects to the human cost in ways most analysis overlooks. The Hellcat's rugged construction meant pilots survived crashes and combat damage that would have killed them in lighter aircraft. Between 1943 and 1945, hundreds of American pilots walked away from wrecked Hellcats. They didn't just survive, they went back into combat with experience the Japanese couldn't replace. Every veteran pilot was a training asset, passing knowledge to new aviators. Every loss Japan suffered removed expertise from their entire system. The Japanese started the war with superbly trained pilots. By 1944, they were sending teenagers with 40 flight hours against American veterans with hundreds. This wasn't just about who had better training programs, it was about who could keep their teachers alive. Let's examine what this looked like through one specific carrier, USS Lexington, November 1943 to June 1944. During that 7-month period, the ship's Hellcat squadron logged over 4,000 combat flight hours. They lost 11 aircraft to enemy action and had 23 damaged badly enough to require major repair. Of those 23, 21 were returned to service aboard the carrier, most within 72 hours. The 2 that couldn't be repaired were stripped for parts that kept other aircraft flying. The squadron never dropped below operational strength. Now contrast that with the Japanese carrier Zuikaku during the same period. Similar combat intensity, similar damage rates, but their Zero units operated at 60 to 70% strength because damaged aircraft piled up faster than repairs could be completed. The mechanical difference between the fighters mattered less than the systemic difference in keeping them airborne. The production story amplifies this advantage in ways that seem almost unfair. Grumman's Bethpage plant operated with an assembly process designed around interchangeable components and simplified construction. Workers with minimal training could build complex assemblies because the designs accommodated human error and variation. Riveting patterns were standardized. Wiring harnesses were color-coded and keyed to prevent incorrect installation. Parts from one Hellcat fit any other Hellcat without modification. This wasn't just efficient, it was strategically devastating. When a Hellcat went down in the Pacific, any available spare part from any supply depot fit perfectly. The Japanese, meanwhile, were discovering that parts manufactured in different factories sometimes required hand-fitting and modification. Their quality control was often superb, but their manufacturing tolerances were tighter than wartime conditions allowed. By early 1944, something remarkable was happening in American carrier operations. Maintenance crews were completing repairs so quickly that the bottleneck shifted from the aircraft to the pilots. There weren't enough rested aviators to fly all the available Hellcats. Japanese commanders faced the opposite problem. Plenty of pilots, not enough airworthy aircraft. This imbalance compounded every other advantage. American pilots flew well-maintained aircraft and accrued experience. Japanese pilots flew worn-out machines and died before they could learn. There's a deeper element here about morale and trust. American pilots knew their aircraft and maintenance crews were reliable. They pushed their Hellcats hard because they trusted they'd been properly maintained. They took battle damage and still made it home because the airframe could absorb punishment. This created a virtuous cycle. Confidence enabled aggressive tactics won engagements, victories reinforced confidence. For Japanese pilots, the cycle ran in reverse. Unreliable maintenance bred caution. Caution reduced effectiveness. Losses eroded what confidence remained. By mid-1944, even veteran Japanese pilots were flying conservatively, trying to preserve aircraft they knew couldn't be easily replaced. The training pipeline tells the same story from a different angle. The United States established a massive pilot training program that produced thousands of aviators. But quantity alone wasn't the secret. The program's length and thoroughness meant pilots arrived at combat squadrons with 300 flight hours, sometimes more. They'd fired thousands of practice rounds, flown hundreds of carrier approaches, and trained against instructors who taught them what mistakes got you killed. The Hellcats' forgiving flight characteristics meant these new pilots could focus on tactics rather than fighting the aircraft. The Zero, spectacular in the hands of an expert, was unforgiving to novices. Japanese training programs, squeezed by fuel shortages and compressed timelines, were sending pilots to carriers with 70 or 80 flight hours. The aircraft's sensitivity to pilot input meant errors compounded quickly. The result was predictable. Even mediocre American pilots were surviving long enough to become dangerous, while promising Japanese pilots died learning lessons their predecessors could have taught them. Now here's where everything interconnects in a way that reveals the true genius of American strategy. Though calling it genius might be generous, it was more like institutional learning at massive scale. The Navy didn't just build Hellcats and train pilots and create logistics networks. They integrated all three into a system where each element reinforced the others. Reliable aircraft meant pilots survived to gain experience. Experienced pilots provided feedback that improved training and tactics. Good logistics kept squadrons operational so that training and experience could be applied continuously. The Japanese had pieces of this puzzle: excellent aircraft design, brave pilots, tactical innovation, but they never assembled the complete system. Their industrial capacity couldn't support it, and by the time they recognized the problem, catching up was impossible. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated this system at its most devastating. American carriers launched wave after wave of Hellcats, recovering damaged aircraft, rearming, and sending them back up. Japanese strike forces encountered a defensive wall so dense that American pilots nicknamed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost over 600 aircraft and most of their remaining veteran pilots. American losses were minimal. The battle wasn't won by superior individual fighter performance. It was won by the ability to maintain numerical superiority through superior logistics, better trained pilots in more reliable aircraft, and maintenance crews who kept the Hellcats flying. There's an often overlooked detail in post-battle analysis. When American carriers retired from the Philippine Sea, their maintenance crews worked around the clock to repair battle damage. Within 3 days, squadron readiness rates were back above 85%. The Japanese fleet limped back to base and spent weeks trying to restore combat capability. They never fully succeeded. The systemic advantages had become insurmountable. Let's talk about the human beings who made this system work. The mechanics, the logistics officers, the training instructors who never fired a shot in anger but won the war just as surely as any pilot. There's a letter from a Hellcat mechanic to his family in Ohio, dated March 1945. He describes working 18-hour shifts, sleeping on the hangar deck, and feeling so exhausted he could barely remember his own name. Then he writes something striking. But every time one of our birds comes back, shot up, and I get it flying again by morning, I know I'm saving somebody's life. Maybe that pilot's got a family too. That mechanic probably never met most of the pilots he kept alive. He certainly never got medals or recognition, but he was as much a part of the Hellcat's victory as any ace. The economics of all this are staggering when you run the numbers. A Hellcat cost roughly $50,000 to manufacture in 1944. Training a pilot to fly it cost approximately twice that when you factored in fuel, instructors, and aircraft attrition during training. Keeping one operational for a year, including all maintenance and spare parts, cost about $15,000. Japan's equivalent costs were lower per unit, but their loss rates and replacement difficulties meant they were losing their investment faster than they could recoup it. By 1945, the US was operating a surplus of both aircraft and pilots, while Japan was rationing fuel for training flights. The war had become mathematically unwinnable, but numbers don't capture what this felt like for the people living through it. There's a Japanese maintenance officer's diary captured after the war that describes his frustration in painful detail. April 1945, Philippines. He writes about having 7 Zeros that need engine overhauls, but only 2 spare engines. He describes cannibalizing 5 aircraft to keep 2 flying. He notes that the pilots, boys really, keep asking when the reinforcements are coming. He knows there are no reinforcements coming. The entry ends, "We are trying to fight a modern war with the methods of another era. The Americans have already won, they just haven't told us yet." That's the hidden story of the Hellcat. It wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a good aircraft embedded in an excellent system, fighting an opponent whose system was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Japanese engineering was often brilliant. Their pilots were brave to the point of tragedy, but bravery and brilliance couldn't overcome an industrial and logistical disadvantage that grew more pronounced every month. The Hellcat won because it was designed to be maintained, built to be produced at scale, and deployed within a network that kept it fighting. Everything else, the speed, the firepower, the armor, mattered only because that foundation existed. By August 1945, the Hellcat had achieved a kill ratio of 19-1, the best of any American fighter in the Pacific, but that ratio doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't account for the Japanese aircraft that never took off because they were grounded for maintenance. It doesn't count the pilots who died in training because fuel shortages compressed their preparation. It doesn't measure the cumulative exhaustion of fighting an enemy that kept coming no matter how many you shot down. The Hellcat's real victory was attrition, not through overwhelming force, but through relentless, efficient, sustainable pressure that never let up. There's a photograph from September 1945 taken on the deck of a carrier in Tokyo Bay. A Hellcat sits in the foreground, scarred and patched but still airworthy. Behind it, you can see Mount Fuji in the distance. The pilot who flew that aircraft wrote a note on the back of the photo. "She's ugly, she's heavy, and she saved my life 11 times. That's the Hellcat's legacy, not glory, but reliability. Not perfection, but effectiveness. In the end, that's what wins wars." Today, when engineers design military systems, they still reference the Hellcat as a case study in integrated design. Build for the humans who'll maintain it. Plan for the logistics that'll sustain it. Train the people who'll use it. These lessons seem obvious now, but in 1941 they were revolutionary. The Hellcat didn't just defeat the Zero, it demonstrated that modern warfare is won not by individual weapons, but by the systems that deploy them. And that lesson, more than any specific technology, changed how nations prepare for war. The last Hellcat was retired from military service in 1954, almost a decade after the war ended. Some nations kept flying them because they were just that reliable. Spare parts were still available. Maintenance procedures were still straightforward. That longevity is perhaps the ultimate testament to Grumman's design philosophy. Build something that works, keep it working, and let that reliability compound into strategic advantage. It's not dramatic, it's not glamorous, but it wins. And in the end, winning is what matters.